Emma Hartwell stood inside her barn on a January morning, watching through the wide opening as her neighbor Thomas struggled to chip frozen snow off his woodpile 30 yards away. She turned, walked 3 steps to her protected firewood stack, selected a perfectly dry split log, and returned to her cabin door without ever stepping into the cold. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The coughing started on January 8, 1842. Emma Hartwell woke to the sound of her husband James struggling to breathe in the darkness of their cabin. She lit a candle and saw his face gray in the flickering light, his chest heaving with effort. The fire in their stone hearth had died to embers during the night. The cabin interior was cold enough that she could see her breath. Emma threw back the wool blankets and hurried to the woodpile. They kept stacked against the interior wall near the door. She grabbed 2 split logs and carried them to the hearth. The wood felt heavy and damp in her hands. She arranged the logs over the embers and waited for them to catch. They smoldered. Smoke filled the cabin instead of rising up the chimney. James coughed harder. She opened the door to clear the smoke. January wind howled into the cabin, dropping the interior temperature even further. Emma closed the door and tried again with the fire. She added kindling. She blew on the embers. The wet wood refused to burn cleanly. It produced smoke and almost no heat. By afternoon, James was delirious with fever. Emma had managed to coax a weak fire from the damp wood, but the effort had taken hours and wasted most of their remaining dry kindling. The cabin was marginally warmer, but smoke hung in the air despite her best efforts to manage the draft. James breathed in shallow gasps. His fever climbed. Emma knew what was happening. She had seen it before in other frontier families. Wet firewood created smoke instead of heat. Smoke in enclosed spaces caused lung sickness. Lung sickness in winter, without proper heat and clean air, killed people. The chain of causation was simple and brutal. She went outside to their main woodpile, a stack of split logs they had prepared in autumn and covered with canvas. The canvas had blown free during a December storm. Snow had buried the pile. Emma dug through frozen snow and pulled out logs covered in ice. She brought them inside and tried to dry them near the weak fire. The process was impossibly slow. Ice melted into water. Water soaked into the wood. The wood produced more smoke when she tried to burn it. For 3 days, Emma fought to keep fire going with wet wood. She barely slept. She burned furniture when the wood proved unusable. She wrapped James in every blanket they owned. On January 11th, his breathing stopped. Emma sat beside his body in the cold cabin and understood, with perfect clarity, that dry firewood would have saved his life. A proper fire would have kept the cabin warm. Clean burning wood would have prevented the smoke that destroyed his lungs. If their firewood had stayed dry through the winter, James would still be breathing. The knowledge settled into Emma's mind like a stone dropping into still water. Her husband had died because their firewood got wet. The solution was obvious. The wood needed to stay dry. Everything else was secondary. Emma buried James on a hillside overlooking their claim on March 2, 1842. The ground had thawed enough to dig. She marked the grave with stones and spent that evening alone in the cabin, unable to sleep. The fire burned cleanly now. Spring wood dried quickly in the wind, but the warmth came too late. She began counting the next morning. Emma walked to the woodpile and calculated how many dry logs would have been needed to keep the cabin warm through January. She estimated fuel consumption per day. She factored in the wettest periods when covered outdoor storage would fail. The mathematics were simple. 12 cords of completely dry firewood, accessible without exposure to weather, would guarantee survival through any winter. 12 cords required significant storage space. A standard woodshed would work if built large enough, but Emma had watched woodsheds fail. Wind drove rain through gaps in siding. Snow drifted against walls and seeped inside. Roofs leaked at seams. Even covered wood grew damp over months of winter weather. She needed something better than a shed. She needed wood stored as protected as if it were inside a building. The idea arrived fully formed one afternoon in late March. Emma was repairing the cabin's exterior chinking when she noticed how the logs themselves stayed dry under the roof overhang, but grew wet just inches away where rain could reach them. Protection from above mattered, but complete enclosure mattered more. Wood stored inside a building would stay perfectly dry. Wood stored inside a building would be accessible regardless of weather. She needed to store 12 cords of firewood inside a structure large enough to hold it. Most settlers would build a large shed or add a wood room onto their cabin. Emma considered both options and rejected them. Additions leaked at the joints where new construction met old. Large sheds were difficult to build alone, and she would be working alone. She needed something simple enough for one woman to construct, but large enough to solve the storage problem completely. She spent April thinking through designs. A barn could hold 12 cords easily. A barn built with proper dimensions could house the firewood and provide covered workspace. But Emma pushed the concept further. If the barn held firewood and the barn provided weather protection, why build the cabin separately? Why not build the cabin inside the barn? The idea seemed absurd at first consideration. Houses belonged separate from barns. But Emma worked through the logic methodically. A cabin built inside a barn would be protected from direct weather. The barn roof would shed rain and snow. The barn walls would block wind. The space between barn and cabin could store firewood with absolute weather protection. She could access her fuel supply without stepping outside. The cabin would benefit from the insulation effect of the surrounding barn structure. By May, Emma had made her decision. She would build a barn first. Then she would build her cabin inside it. The firewood would be stored in the space between. Neighbors would think she was insane. She did not care. Dry firewood would have saved James. She would never face wet firewood again. Emma walked into Millbrook's General Store on May 14, 1842, and asked Samuel Porter for barn-building supplies. She needed timber hardware, nails in quantity, and information about sawmill prices for dimensional lumber. Samuel looked at the young widow with confusion. She lived alone now. What did she need with barn materials? Emma explained her plan clearly. She would build a barn structure approximately 30 feet by 20 feet. After completing the barn, she would construct a cabin inside it. The space between the barn walls and cabin would store her firewood supply. Samuel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down the ledger he had been holding. He asked if she understood what she was proposing. A barn that size would take 3 men most of a summer to build. She was one woman. She had no experience with timber framing. The cost of materials alone would consume most of what James had left her. And at the end of all that effort, she would have a cabin inside a barn, which made no practical sense when she could simply build a cabin and a woodshed for half the cost and labor. Emma asked again about the materials. Samuel sold her what she requested, but he mentioned the conversation to his wife that evening. Sarah Porter mentioned it to neighbors. By the end of May, everyone in Millbrook knew that Emma Hartwell planned to build a barn around a house. The reaction was consistent. Grief had broken her mind. Thomas Crawford, whose land bordered Emma's claim, visited her in early June. He was a practical man who had survived 15 winters on the frontier. He sat at her table and spoke gently. He understood she was lonely. He understood the winter had been hard, but this barn plan was madness born from sorrow. She should build a proper cabin, find a husband, or move back east to family. Building alone was dangerous. Building a barn before a house was backwards. Building a house inside a barn was insane. Emma thanked him for his concern and continued her preparations. She had already laid out the barn's foundation line using stakes and string. She had purchased timber from the sawmill and hauled it to her property over multiple trips with her horse and sledge. She had studied barn construction by visiting 3 farms and asking questions about post and beam framing. Thomas left frustrated. He told others that Emma would not listen to reason. The consensus in Millbrook became that someone should intervene, but frontier culture respected property rights and individual choice. If Emma Hartwell wanted to waste her resources on a barn that housed a cabin, that was her decision. They would watch her fail, then help her build something sensible afterward. Emma began digging foundation holes on June 10th. The work was brutal. Each hole needed to be 3 feet deep to reach solid earth below the frost line. She dug with a post-hole digger and a shovel. Her hands blistered. Her back ached. She worked from dawn until dark. Neighbors passing by saw her digging and shook their heads. The widow was committed to her madness. The foundation posts went into the ground during the 3rd week of June. Emma had cut them from straight pines she felled herself on the wooded section of her property. Each post was 10 inches in diameter and 12 feet long. She stripped the bark and shaped the bottoms to points so they would settle firmly into the holes she had dug. Setting the posts required techniques Emma learned by watching barn construction and asking questions others thought were idle curiosity. She positioned each post vertically in its hole, then filled the hole with rocks and tamped earth. The process was slow. A single post took most of a day to set properly. She had 16 posts to install around the barn's perimeter. By early July, the foundation posts stood like a forest of sentinels marking the barn's outline. Emma checked them obsessively for vertical alignment, using a plumb line she made from a stone tied to string. If the posts leaned, the entire structure would be crooked. She adjusted posts that showed even minor deviation, digging them out and resetting them until satisfied. Thomas Crawford visited again and found Emma digging around a post she had already set 3 times. He asked what she was doing. She explained the post was leaning 1/2 degree off vertical. That deviation would compound when she added horizontal beams. The barn needed perfect foundation alignment, or everything built upon it would be compromised. Thomas looked at the other posts standing in precise formation and realized Emma was not simply grieving. She was executing a plan with engineering precision he had not expected from anyone, let alone a woman working alone. He offered to help. Emma declined politely. She needed to understand every connection and technique herself. If something failed, she needed to know why and how to fix it. The town's opinion shifted slightly. Emma was still crazy for building a barn before a house, but she was apparently competent at the actual construction. People began stopping by to watch her work. Some offered advice. Emma listened politely and continued using her own methods. She began installing the horizontal support beams in mid-July. These beams connected the vertical posts and formed the frame onto which she would build walls and roof. Each beam was a full log, approximately 8 inches in diameter and spanning the distance between posts. The beams needed to be perfectly level. Emma built a simple lifting system using pulleys she purchased from the general store. She rigged ropes through the pulleys and attached them to the beams. By pulling on the ropes while using her horse for additional force, she could lift beams that weighed several hundred pounds and position them onto the posts. The process looked dangerous. She worked alone, controlling both the horse and the positioning simultaneously. Sarah Porter watched one afternoon and asked if Emma feared being crushed. Emma replied that she feared wet firewood more than heavy timber. If she stayed careful and thought through each step, the timber would not fall. But wet firewood had already killed her husband. She would take her chances with the timber. The beams went up one by one through late July. Emma notched each connection point so the beams seated firmly onto the posts. She drilled holes and drove wooden pegs to lock the joints. The structure grew solid and square. By August, Emma's barn frame rose 12 feet above the ground. The vertical posts and horizontal beams created a skeleton of what the finished structure would become. She worked through the hottest part of summer, starting before dawn and continuing until darkness made precision work impossible. Her hands developed calluses thick as leather. Her shoulders and back grew strong from lifting, positioning, and securing timber. The roof frame presented the greatest challenge. Emma needed to raise ridge beams that would span the barn's 30-foot length and support the roof structure. Each ridge beam weighed approximately 400 pounds. Standard barn construction required multiple men to lift such timbers. Emma had only herself, her horse, and her pulley system. She spent 3 days rigging an elaborate arrangement of ropes, pulleys, and anchor points. The system allowed her to multiply her force enough to lift the massive beams incrementally. She would pull on ropes to raise one end of a beam several inches, then secure it. Move to the other end and raise it to match. Repeat the process dozens of times until the beam reached its final position 12 feet above the ground. Neighbors gathered to watch the first ridge beam ascent. They expected catastrophic failure. The beam rose slowly, swaying slightly as Emma worked the pulley system. Her horse provided steady pulling force on the main line while Emma guided the beam and managed the securing ropes. After 6 hours of careful work, the ridge beam settled into its notched supports. Emma pegged it in place and began rigging for the second beam. Thomas Crawford told others that evening that he had watched something he could not explain. A woman, barely over 5 feet tall, had lifted a timber that 4 men would struggle to carry. She had done it alone, using nothing but rope, pulleys, and systematic thinking. Some called it witchcraft. Thomas said it was intelligence applied to physics. The whispers started quietly. Emma worked too precisely for normal female capacity. She understood leverage and force distribution in ways that seemed unnatural. She must have help from dark sources. How else could she accomplish such work alone? Emma heard the whispers and ignored them. She had no time for superstition. The roof frame required 6 major ridge beams and dozens of smaller supporting members. Each piece needed to be cut, shaped, lifted, positioned, and secured. She worked through September, installing the roof structure piece by piece. By October, the barn's skeleton was complete. Posts, beams, and roof framing stood in weathered timber geometry. Emma had built the framework for a structure larger than most farmhouses in the region. She had done it alone in 4 months. The accomplishment silenced some critics. Others doubled their mockery. She had wasted an entire season building an empty barn frame. Winter was coming. Where would she live? Emma began installing the barn's roof covering. She had purchased rough-sawn boards from the sawmill and hauled them to her property throughout the summer. Now she nailed them across the roof frame in overlapping courses that would shed water. The work went faster than the framing. By late October, the barn had a weatherproof roof. The barn roof was finished on November 2nd, 1842. Emma stood inside the structure and looked up at the underside of the boards she had nailed down over the past 3 weeks. Rain drummed on the roof. Inside the barn, the ground stayed dry. She had created weather protection large enough to hold everything she planned. Neighbors asked when she would start her actual house. Winter was perhaps 6 weeks away. She could not survive the cold living in an open barn frame. Emma replied that she would begin the cabin soon. First, she needed to close the barn's sides to complete the weather protection. The questions irritated her. She had a plan. She was executing it systematically. Everyone else's concern was irrelevant. She installed vertical board siding on 3 sides of the barn during November. The 4th side, facing south, she left partially open to provide access and light. The opening was wide enough to drive a wagon through. She could close it later with large doors if needed, but for now, the opening served her purposes. The barn became the talk of Millbrook. Emma Hartwell had built a structure that rivaled the best barns in the county. The framing was square and solid. The roof did not leak. The siding was tight. She had accomplished professional quality construction working entirely alone. Some residents began to respect her competence. Others insisted the barn proved nothing except wasted effort. She still had no house. She still faced winter with inadequate shelter. Emma moved her few possessions into the barn in late November. She set up a temporary living space in one corner with her bed, table, and essential supplies. She built a small fire pit for cooking and heat. The arrangement was crude but functional. The barn roof kept rain and snow off her. The partial walls blocked most wind. She was comfortable enough for the short term. Then she began laying out the cabin's foundation inside the barn. She used stakes and string to mark a rectangle 16 feet wide and 14 feet deep. The cabin would sit near the center of the barn, leaving approximately 7 feet of space between the cabin walls and barn walls on all sides. That space would hold her firewood. People who visited and saw the staked outline finally understood what Emma was building. She was actually constructing a house inside the barn. The concept was so strange that some visitors asked multiple questions to ensure they understood correctly. Yes, a complete cabin with walls, roof, windows, and door. Yes, inside the barn. Yes, she would live in the cabin while the barn surrounded it. Yes, she understood how odd this seemed. Thomas Crawford asked the question others were thinking. Why not simply build the cabin by itself and be done with it? Emma's answer was simple. A cabin surrounded by barn walls would never face direct weather. The barn would protect it from rain, snow, and wind. The space between would store 12 cords of firewood with absolute protection from moisture. She would access dry fuel regardless of conditions outside. Her husband died because wet firewood filled their cabin with smoke. She would never face that situation again. Thomas considered her logic and found it sound, even if unconventional. The barn and cabin system would solve the firewood storage problem completely. Whether the solution justified the effort remained to be seen. Emma began her cabin construction on December 1st, 1842. She started by laying a foundation of flat stones arranged in a level rectangle following the string lines she had marked. The stones would keep the cabin's base logs off the ground, preventing rot from soil moisture. She gathered the stones from a creek bed on her property, selecting flat pieces that would stack evenly. The foundation work took a week. Emma placed each stone carefully, checking level with a straight edge and adjusting until satisfied. When finished, she had a stone base exactly 16 feet by 14 feet, raised 6 inches above the barn floor, the precision matching her barn construction standards. She began laying cabin logs on December 9th. The logs were pine, 10 to 12 inches in diameter, stripped of bark and shaped to consistent roundness. Emma had prepared them during the summer, cutting and storing them to dry while she built the barn frame. Now she lifted them onto her stone foundation and began notching corners. The corner joints required careful work. Emma used a saddle notch technique, cutting curved recesses in each log so they interlocked at right angles. Each notch needed to be identical in depth and curve for the corners to rise evenly. She worked with a hatchet, chisel, and saw, removing wood in controlled cuts until the fit was precise. Neighbors who stopped by found the scene surreal. Inside a large barn, a woman was building a log cabin using techniques normally employed by experienced carpenters. The cabin walls rose one log at a time. Emma worked alone, lifting each log into position using a small ramp and lever system. She would roll a log up the ramp, then use a wooden lever to shift it onto the wall. Once positioned, she would notch the corners and pin the log to those below using wooden pegs. The work was slow. Each log required hours of shaping, lifting, positioning, and securing. Emma maintained her dawn-to-dark work schedule. By late December, the cabin walls had risen to waist height. The structure's outline was clear, 4 walls forming a rectangle sitting on stone foundation, growing upward one log at a time inside the protective barn. Sarah Porter visited on December 20th and brought bread. She found Emma fitting a log, adjusting its position with careful taps from a wooden mallet. Sarah watched for several minutes before speaking. She said the cabin looked well built. Emma thanked her and continued working. Sarah asked if Emma would finish before the worst winter weather arrived. Emma replied that she would finish when the cabin was built correctly. Speed mattered less than quality. The cabin walls reached shoulder height by year's end. Emma had laid 23 courses of logs, creating walls nearly 5 feet tall. She needed approximately 15 more courses to reach the height where she would begin roof construction. At her current pace, the walls would be complete by late January. The mockery from town had quieted somewhat. Emma's barn stood, solid through early winter storms. Her cabin construction showed the same competence she had demonstrated in barn building. People still thought the entire project was excessive and strange, but they could no longer claim she did not know what she was doing. The cabin walls reached full height on January 28, 1843. Emma stepped back and examined the structure she had built inside her barn. 4 walls of carefully fitted logs stood 7 feet tall, creating interior space that would be her home. Now came the roof, and Emma had designed something more complex than standard cabin construction required. Most frontier cabins used simple gabled roofs, 2 sloping planes meeting at a central ridge. Emma planned a double gable design with 2 overlapping roof sections at different heights. The front section would cover the front third of the cabin with a lower roof line. The rear section would cover the remaining space with a higher peak. The design would create interior height variation and improve structural integrity. Thomas Crawford visited while she was cutting rafters for the first roof section. He examined her measurements and asked why she was building 2 roofs instead of 1. Emma explained that the stepped design would distribute snow load across more support points. The height difference would create better air circulation inside. The overlapping sections would provide redundancy if one section leaked. Thomas said it was overcomplicated. A single roof would be faster and simpler. Emma replied that she was not optimizing for speed or simplicity. She was building a cabin that would function perfectly for decades. If that required more complex construction, she would do more complex construction. She began raising the front roof section in early February. The gable frame consisted of 2 triangular end pieces connected by a ridge beam. Emma built the triangular frames on the ground, then lifted them onto the cabin walls using her pulley system. The frames were heavy and awkward. She worked carefully, securing each piece before moving to the next step. The front roof took 2 weeks to complete. When finished, it created a distinct peaked section covering the front portion of the cabin. Emma immediately began work on the rear section. This roof needed to be taller to create the stepped effect she wanted. She built larger triangular frames and positioned them behind the front roof section. Local carpenters heard about the double roof and came to see it. They found Emma installing rafters on the second roof section. The design looked strange, but structurally sound. One carpenter asked if she had training in roof framing. Emma said no. She had studied barn roofs and church roofs in town, then adapted what she learned to her specific requirements. The carpenters discussed the design among themselves. The stepped roof line would create a valley where the 2 sections met. That valley would collect water and potentially leak. Emma needed to seal it perfectly or face interior water damage. They told her this. Emma said she understood and had planned for it. She installed wooden boards across both roof sections in overlapping courses. Where the 2 roofs met, she cut careful angles so the boards interlocked without gaps. Then she applied a thick layer of pine tar along the valley seam, covering it completely. Over the tar, she nailed additional boards, creating a double-sealed joint. The carpenters admitted the valley seal looked adequate. The entire roof structure showed unusual sophistication for someone with no formal training. Emma traveled to Millbrook on March 3, 1843, and purchased 4 glass windows from Samuel Porter's General Store. Each window consisted of 4 panes in a 2x2 grid set in wooden frames. The cost was significant. Glass was expensive on the frontier. Most cabins had 1 window at most, often covered with oiled paper or greased cloth, instead of actual glass. Samuel asked why she needed 4 windows for a cabin inside a barn where natural light would be limited anyway. Emma replied that she valued being able to see clearly during the day. The windows would face the barn's open side where light entered. She would have good illumination without needing candles during daylight hours. The purchase became immediate gossip. Emma Hartwell had spent a small fortune on glass windows for a cabin that sat inside a barn. The excess was absurd. She could have built a normal cabin with normal windows for half the total cost she had invested in her barn cabin system. People said she was using her late husband's money to indulge grief-driven delusions. Emma hauled the windows back to her property and began cutting openings in her cabin walls. She had planned the window positions during initial construction, leaving gaps in the chinking at specific locations. Now she cut through the logs using a saw, creating rectangular openings, 18 inches wide and 24 inches tall. The window installation required precise work. Each opening needed to be exactly sized to accept the window frame with minimal gap. Emma measured carefully, cut slowly, and fitted each window into place. She secured the frames by nailing through them into the surrounding logs, then sealed the joints with her clay and pine resin mixture. By mid-March, all 4 windows were installed across the cabin's front wall. The effect was striking. Light flooded into the interior space. Emma could see clearly throughout the cabin during daylight. The windows also provided excellent views of the barn interior and the open entrance beyond. Thomas Crawford visited and found Emma applying final chinking around the window frames. He looked at the 4 windows and shook his head. He said it looked like a townhouse, not a frontier cabin. Emma said she saw no reason why a frontier cabin could not have adequate light. Windows improved quality of life. She intended to live comfortably, not merely survive. The windows sparked fresh mockery in town. Sarah Porter heard several women discussing Emma's extravagance. 4 glass windows in a cabin inside a barn, inside a structure that had consumed an entire year of labor. The whole project was vanity disguised as practicality. Emma should have remarried and let a husband provide proper shelter. Emma heard the gossip secondhand and dismissed it. She had never built anything to impress others. The barn cabin system served specific functional purposes: weather protection for the structure, weather protection for firewood, comfortable living space. Everything else was irrelevant. She finished the cabin interior in late March. She built a stone fireplace in one corner, constructing it from rocks she had gathered and shaped over the winter months. The fireplace included a proper chimney that extended up through both cabin roof sections and exited above the barn roof. She installed a wooden floor, using planks laid across floor joists. She built a sleeping platform, shelves, a table, and storage spaces. On April 1, 1843, Emma began splitting firewood. She had been stockpiling logs throughout the winter, cutting trees from her wooded property and hauling them to the barn. Now she would convert those logs into the split firewood that would fill the space between her cabin walls and barn walls. She worked with a splitting maul and wedges. The process was simple but exhausting. Place a log upright on a chopping block. Strike it with the maul to start a split. Drive wedges into the split to widen it. The log would crack apart into halves or quarters depending on size. Stack the split pieces to dry and season. Emma split wood from dawn until mid-afternoon each day. Her hands blistered again despite the calluses she had developed during construction. Her shoulders ached from swinging the heavy maul. She ignored the discomfort and maintained her pace. 12 cords of firewood required splitting approximately 300 logs. She had 4 months before winter to complete the work. The split wood piled up in neat stacks around the cabin's exterior. Emma arranged it carefully, leaving air gaps between pieces so moisture could escape as the wood seasoned. Green wood contained significant moisture. It needed months to dry before it would burn efficiently. By splitting now, she ensured the wood would be ready for winter. Neighbors saw the growing wood piles during visits and finally understood the scale of Emma's planning. The space between cabin and barn walls was becoming a firewood warehouse. When complete, she would have enough dry fuel to burn continuously for an entire winter without ever needing to venture outside the barn for more. Thomas Crawford calculated the volume and told others that Emma had created storage for at least 12 cords, possibly 15, depending on how tightly she stacked. That quantity exceeded what most families burned. In a full winter, Emma was building redundancy into her fuel supply. Even in the harshest winter, she would have surplus. The work continued through April and into May. Emma split, stacked, and arranged firewood with the same methodical precision she had applied to construction. Each stack was organized by wood type: oak and hickory for long-burning overnight fires, pine and birch for quick heat. She labeled sections with charcoal marks on the barn posts. By June, the firewood storage was half complete. 6 cords of split wood surrounded the cabin in neat, organized stacks. Emma could walk around her cabin on pathways between the wood piles. The barn interior had transformed into exactly what she had envisioned: a protected cabin surrounded by protected fuel, all under one weatherproof roof. Sarah Porter visited in early July and walked through the barn, examining the system Emma had created. She looked at the cabin with its 4 windows and double roof. She looked at the mountains of split firewood stacked in perfect order. She looked at Emma, who was splitting more wood despite already having enough for multiple winters. Sarah asked why Emma kept working when she clearly had sufficient fuel already. Emma paused and leaned on her maul. She said she was building insurance against catastrophe. Wet firewood killed her husband. She would never face inadequate dry fuel again. The first frost arrived on September 18, 1843. Emma woke to ice crystals on the grass visible through her barn's open entrance. She had finished splitting and stacking firewood in late August. 12 cords of perfectly seasoned wood now surrounded her cabin in organized walls of fuel. She spent September completing final preparations for winter. Thomas Crawford visited on September 22nd with concerning news. Old-timers in Millbrook were predicting an early and harsh winter. The woolly caterpillars showed thick bands of black. Squirrels were gathering nuts with unusual intensity. The signs pointed to heavy snow arriving before November. Thomas suggested Emma should consider moving into town for the winter. Her barn cabin system was untested. If something failed during severe weather, she would be isolated and vulnerable. Emma thanked him for the concern and declined. Her system would work. She had built everything to withstand the worst conditions. The barn roof was solid, the cabin was tight. Her firewood was dry and accessible. She would be fine. Thomas persisted. He said even if her structures held, living alone through a hard winter was dangerous. A broken bone, a serious illness, any emergency would be potentially fatal without nearby help. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away. Emma replied that she had faced the previous winter alone and survived. She would manage. Other neighbors echoed Thomas's concerns throughout September. The widow Hartwell should not spend winter isolated in her experimental barn house. She should accept hospitality from a family in town. She should at least move into a conventional cabin closer to other settlers. The barn system was too risky for its first winter trial. Emma heard the same arguments repeatedly and gave the same answer. She appreciated their concern, but would stay in her own home. The barn and cabin were built specifically to handle harsh winters. She wanted to prove the system worked. Sarah Porter tried a different approach. She visited on September 30th and spoke directly. The town thought Emma was stubborn to the point of self-destruction. People worried about her safety. If she stayed and the winter was as bad as predicted, she might die alone. Was proving a point worth that risk? Emma set down the tool she was sharpening and looked at Sarah. She explained that this was not about proving points to the town. This was about never being vulnerable to wet firewood again. James died because their wood got wet. She had built a system that made that impossible. She needed to live in it and trust it. If she moved to town every winter, what was the purpose of building it? Sarah understood but remained worried. She made Emma promise to signal if she needed help. Emma agreed. She would hang a white cloth from the barn entrance if she required assistance. Otherwise, people should assume she was managing. October arrived with unusually cold temperatures. The caterpillars had been right. Winter was coming early. Emma moved her remaining possessions into the cabin on October 5, 1843. Everything she owned fit into the 16 by 14-foot space. Her bed table, chairs, cooking implements, clothing, tools, and personal items found places in the organized interior. She arranged the space with the same precision she had applied to construction. The cabin felt solid and comfortable. The stone fireplace drew well, sending smoke up through the chimney without backdraft. The wooden floor was level and smooth. The 4 windows provided excellent light during the day. At night, the space stayed warm with a modest fire. The barn surrounding the cabin blocked drafts completely. Emma spent the first week of October testing her systems. She cooked meals using her fireplace. She monitored how quickly the cabin warmed and how long it retained heat. She practiced accessing her firewood stores, walking from the cabin door to the nearest woodpile in the barn, selecting fuel, and returning. The process took less than a minute and required no exposure to weather. On October 12th, a delegation from Millbrook arrived. Thomas Crawford, Samuel Porter, and Pastor Wilson came to speak with Emma about the approaching winter. They found her outside the barn, repairing a section of siding. Pastor Wilson took the lead. He said the community cared about her well-being. Living alone in an untested structure through what promised to be a severe winter was unwise. They had arranged space with the Porter family if she would reconsider. Emma climbed down from her ladder and faced the 3 men. She appreciated their concern, but her decision was final. She would stay in her home. The structure was not untested. She had tested every element during construction. The barn was weatherproof. The cabin was sound. Her firewood was dry and plentiful. She had food supplies. She had water access. She would be fine. Samuel said she was being unreasonably stubborn. Emma replied that she was being reasonably prepared. There was a difference. They were welcome to check on her periodically, but she would not abandon her home because others doubted it. The men left frustrated. Thomas told others that evening that Emma seemed completely confident in her barn cabin system. Whether that confidence was justified or delusional remained to be seen. Winter would provide the answer. The first snow fell on October 24th, light flakes that accumulated to an inch before melting. Emma watched from inside her cabin. The barn roof shed the snow efficiently. None entered the barn interior. Her firewood stayed completely dry. She lit a fire and enjoyed the warmth while snow fell outside. More snow came on October 29th. This time 4 inches accumulated. The temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. Winter had arrived a month early, just as predicted. Emma settled into her routines. She maintained her fire, cooked her meals, and managed her time. The cabin stayed comfortable. The firewood remained accessible and dry. November brought the storm old-timers had warned about. On November 9, 1843, snow began falling at dawn and continued for 36 hours. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees. Wind drove the snow sideways. By the time the storm ended, 2 feet of snow covered the landscape. Drifts reached 4 and 5 feet in places where wind accumulated it. Emma watched the storm from her cabin windows. Snow piled against the barn's exterior walls, but did not enter through the entrance. The barn's orientation and overhang kept the interior protected. A thin layer of snow blew onto the barn floor near the entrance, but melted quickly from the ambient warmth trapped inside the structure. The cabin stayed warm throughout the storm. Emma burned oak in her fireplace, maintaining steady heat. The barn surrounding her cabin acted as insulation. Cold air outside had to penetrate the barn before reaching the cabin walls. The temperature inside the barn remained significantly warmer than outside temperature. The cabin interior stayed comfortable with moderate fuel consumption. When the storm ended, Emma ventured outside the barn to assess conditions. Snow reached above her knees. The landscape was buried. She could see smoke rising from distant cabins where neighbors were burning wood to stay warm. She returned to her barn and walked to her firewood stores. Every piece was bone dry. Not a single snowflake had touched her fuel supply. Thomas Crawford struggled through deep snow to check on Emma on November 11th. He found her outside the barn, shoveling a path to her well. She had already cleared the area and was working methodically. Thomas asked how she had fared during the storm. Emma said she had been fine. Warm cabin, dry wood, plenty of supplies. Thomas described his own experience. His woodpile, covered with canvas, had still gotten wet. Snow had blown under the canvas edges and soaked the outer layers of his wood stack. He was burning damp wood that created more smoke than heat. He would need to bring wood inside his cabin to dry before burning. The process was slow and inconvenient. Emma invited him into the barn. She showed him her firewood storage, 12 cords of split wood stacked between cabin and barn walls. Thomas picked up a piece, completely dry. He examined the storage arrangement and understood immediately. The barn roof kept precipitation away. The barn walls blocked wind-blown snow. The elevation off the ground prevented moisture wicking. Emma's fuel supply would stay dry regardless of weather conditions outside. Thomas asked if he could purchase some of her dry wood. His family was struggling with wet fuel. Emma gave him an armload without charge. She said she had plenty. He could take what he needed. Thomas accepted gratefully and said he would tell others what he had seen. Word spread through Millbrook over the following days. The widow Hartwell's barn cabin system had survived the November storm perfectly. While everyone else fought wet firewood and cold cabins, Emma had stayed warm and comfortable. Her elaborate construction was proving its value. December brought steady cold and additional snow. Emma settled into winter routines that demonstrated the efficiency of her barn cabin system. Each morning she woke, rebuilt her fire from banked coals, and prepared breakfast. When she needed firewood, she opened her cabin door, walked 3 steps to the nearest woodpile, selected appropriate pieces, and returned to warmth. The entire process took less than a minute and never required her to step outside the barn. Her neighbors faced different realities. Every cabin in the region stored firewood outside, protected at best by simple shelters or canvas covers. Snow accumulated on and around these wood piles. Each time someone needed fuel, they bundled in heavy clothing, trudged through snow to their woodpile, dug through snow to reach wood, and carried it back to their cabin. The wood was often wet or frozen. It needed time near the fire to dry before burning efficiently. Emma burned dry wood immediately. She could select specific wood types for specific purposes. Oak for overnight fires that needed to burn slowly. Birch for quick morning heat. Pine for cooking fires that required fast, hot flames. Her system gave her options others lacked. On December 15th, Sarah Porter visited during a light snowfall. She found Emma working at her table near the window, mending clothes in natural light. The cabin was comfortably warm. Sarah commented that the interior felt warmer than her own home, despite similar outside temperatures. Emma explained the barn effect. The outer structure trapped warmer air. Her cabin sat inside that warmer envelope. She needed less fuel to maintain comfort. Sarah asked to see the firewood storage. Emma showed her the systematic arrangement, wood organized by type, stacked with air gaps for continued drying, accessible from multiple points around the cabin. Sarah picked up a piece of oak, completely dry, slightly warm from the ambient barn temperature. She compared it to the frozen, snow-covered logs her husband hauled from their outdoor pile. The difference was dramatic. Sarah asked how much wood Emma burned per day. Emma estimated she used approximately 1/8 cord daily during the coldest weather. Her 12-cord supply would last over 90 days of continuous burning. She had enough fuel to burn fires day and night through the entire winter with surplus remaining. Sarah did calculations mentally. Her family burned similar amounts, but struggled constantly with wet wood. They wasted fuel on inefficient fires. They dealt with smoke from damp logs. They risked running short because bad weather prevented accessing their woodpile. Emma faced none of these problems. When Sarah returned to town, she told her husband what she had seen. Samuel Porter shared the information with others. The Widow Hartwell system was not just working, it was working significantly better than conventional arrangements. While everyone else fought winter, Emma lived comfortably. The barn cabin design was proving superior to traditional frontier housing. Opinions began shifting. Maybe Emma was not crazy. Maybe she had understood something others had missed. January 1844 brought the coldest temperatures in recent memory. The mercury dropped below zero and stayed there for days. Smoke from cabin chimneys hung in the still air. People burned wood constantly, trying to maintain livable interior temperatures. Fuel consumption accelerated. Families who had thought their wood supplies adequate began worrying about running short before spring. The Crawford family faced crisis on January 20th. Thomas had stacked what he estimated was enough firewood for winter, but the early cold and constant burning depleted his supply faster than expected. His 2 young children needed warmth. His wife was pregnant. They could not reduce their fire without risking everyone's health. Thomas took his children into the forest to gather more wood. The work was brutal. Snow was waist-deep. They had to dig to find fallen branches and small trees. Everything was frozen solid and covered in ice. His son, age 9, worked beside him. His daughter, age 7, helped carry smaller pieces. After 4 hours, they had gathered perhaps 1/10 cord of marginal wood. Much of it was wet or frozen. It would burn poorly. On January 22nd, Thomas walked to Emma's property to ask if he could purchase more dry wood. He found Emma outside her barn, enjoying the winter sun despite the cold. She was well-dressed and appeared comfortable. Thomas explained his situation. His family was burning through wood faster than anticipated. Could he buy several cords of her surplus? Emma brought Thomas into the barn and showed him her remaining stores. She had burned approximately 3 cords since November. 9 cords remained, more than enough for the rest of winter. She told Thomas he could take 2 cords. He asked the price. Emma said there was no price. He needed dry wood for his family. She had surplus. He should take what he needed. Thomas was stunned by the generosity. He offered to pay or work off the debt. Emma refused. She remembered what inadequate firewood meant. She would not charge neighbors for something that might save their lives. Thomas accepted and spent the next day hauling wood from Emma's barn to his cabin. His children would stay warm. Word of Emma's gift spread quickly. Other families facing fuel shortages came to ask if they could also purchase wood. Emma gave away another 2 cords to 3 families in desperate situations. She still had 5 cords remaining, far more than she would burn before spring. The gifts created a shift in community perception. Emma Hartwell was not hoarding her surplus or profiting from others' misfortune. She was sharing freely with those in need. The barn cabin system that everyone had mocked was now helping families survive the harsh winter. Pastor Wilson mentioned Emma during his January 28th sermon. He spoke of the wisdom in preparing thoroughly and the virtue in sharing abundance. Emma was not present, but several families were. On February 4, 1844, Thomas Crawford returned to Emma's property with Samuel Porter and 2 other men from Millbrook. They had come to see her barn cabin system with serious intent. Thomas had described it, but they needed to understand the construction details. Several families were already planning to build similar structures before next winter. Emma welcomed them into the barn. She walked them through the entire system, explaining each element. The barn structure came first, creating weatherproof space. The cabin built inside provided living quarters surrounded by insulation and protection. The firewood stored between the 2 structures stayed dry regardless of weather while remaining easily accessible. Samuel examined the barn framing and asked specific questions about post spacing, beam sizing, and roof construction. Emma answered each question precisely. She had kept mental notes of every dimension and technique. She shared information freely, holding nothing back. If others wanted to build similar structures, she would help them avoid mistakes. One man asked about cost. Emma estimated the barn cabin system cost approximately 40% more than building a standard cabin and separate woodshed. However, the system provided superior weather protection, better insulation, guaranteed dry firewood, and covered workspace. The additional cost was justified by the improved functionality. Another man asked about construction time. Emma said she had worked alone for 14 months, but much of that time went to learning techniques. With experience and multiple workers, a barn cabin could be completed in 4 to 5 months. Families could build during summer and be ready for winter. Thomas asked the question others were thinking. Why had Emma built this when no one else had? The principles were not complicated. Weather protection for firewood was obvious once seen. Why had frontier settlers not developed this approach years ago? Emma considered the question. She said most people built the minimum necessary to survive. They accepted wet firewood as unavoidable. They did not question traditional methods. She had questioned everything. After losing James, that questioning led to different answers. Innovation came from refusing to accept that current methods were the only methods. The men discussed construction plans among themselves. 3 families committed to building barn cabins before next winter. They would pool labor and help each other. Samuel said he would stock additional barn building supplies at the general store. There would be demand. Before leaving, Thomas asked Emma if she regretted the mockery and doubt she had faced. Emma said no. Other people's opinions during construction were irrelevant. What mattered was building something that worked. The barn cabin worked. Vindication was not important. Function was important. The delegation left with detailed notes and measurements. Emma had transformed from the crazy widow building a barn around a house into the pioneer who had solved a fundamental frontier problem. Her innovation would spread because it worked better than existing methods. March brought the first thaw. Snow melted slowly, revealing the winter's toll on standard frontier structures. Several cabins had developed roof leaks from ice dams. Woodsheds had collapsed under snow weight. Families tallied the costs of a harsh winter and calculated how much fuel they had burned. The 3 families who had committed to building barn cabins began planning in earnest. The Crawfords, the Hendersons, and the Yates family met regularly to discuss construction strategies. They visited Emma's property multiple times, studying her barn structure and asking detailed questions. Emma helped them refine their plans. She suggested modifications based on what she had learned. Place the barn entrance facing south for maximum light and sun warmth. Build the cabin slightly off-center in the barn to allow more firewood storage on one side. Include proper drainage around the barn foundation to prevent water accumulation. Thomas Crawford began construction on April 10th. His design followed Emma's general concept but adapted to his larger family's needs. His barn would be 35 feet by 25 feet. His cabin would be slightly larger than Emma's to accommodate his wife and children. He recruited help from the Henderson and Yates families, trading labor across all 3 projects. The construction proceeded faster than Emma's solo effort. With experienced hands and shared knowledge, the barn frames rose quickly. By May, all 3 barns had roofs. By June, the cabins inside were taking shape. The families planned to have everything complete by September. Other settlers watched the construction with interest. The barn cabin concept was proving practical beyond Emma's single example. Multiple families were successfully implementing the system. By midsummer, 2 additional families had started their own barn cabin projects. Samuel Porter told Emma in July that the barn cabin design was becoming the preferred construction method for new settlements in the region. People called it the Hartwell method. Emma said she did not care what they called it as long as it kept families warm and safe. Sarah Porter asked Emma if she felt vindicated after 2 years of mockery and doubt. Emma replied that vindication was the wrong word. She felt satisfied that a good idea was spreading. James's death had led to an innovation that would prevent others from facing similar tragedies. That outcome mattered more than personal validation. The summer brought visitors from distant settlements. People heard about the barn cabin system and traveled to see examples. Emma gave tours and answered questions. She never charged for information or claimed ownership of the concept. She wanted the idea to spread as widely as possible. By autumn 1844, 7 barn cabin structures existed in the region. 5 more were under construction. The design was becoming standard rather than experimental. Emma's innovation had achieved widespread adoption in less than 2 years. The winter of 1844 to 1845 was mild compared to the previous year, but the barn cabin structures proved their value regardless of severity. Families living in the new designs reported consistent comfort, dry firewood, and reduced fuel consumption. The system worked exactly as Emma had demonstrated. By spring of 1845, the Hartwell method had spread beyond Millbrook. Travelers carried descriptions to other frontier settlements. A trapper heading to Montana Territory mentioned seeing a barnhouse design that solved firewood storage problems. A merchant traveling east described the innovation to settlers preparing to move west. The concept spread through word of mouth, carried by people who recognized practical value. Emma lived quietly through these years. She maintained her barn cabin, managed her property, and helped neighbors when asked. She never promoted herself or sought recognition. When visitors came to see her original structure, she answered questions and shared information freely. She wanted people to build well, not to credit her. Thomas Crawford told her in 1846 that at least 30 barn cabin structures existed across the Northern Territories. The number would grow as more families settled the frontier. Emma's response to her husband's death had created architectural change across thousands of square miles. Thomas said she should feel proud. Emma said she felt relieved that fewer people would face what she had faced. The specific design details varied as builders adapted the concept to local conditions and materials. Some built smaller barns. Some used different roofing techniques. Some modified the cabin layouts, but the core principle remained constant. A protective outer structure surrounding a dwelling with firewood stored in the protected space between. The principle worked regardless of specific implementation. Historical records from the period mention the barn cabin design in scattered documents. A settler's diary from 1848 describes building a cabin inside a barn like the Hartwell design from Montana. A territorial surveyor's report from 1850 notes that several homesteads used the barn house method for winter fuel storage. The references are brief but consistent. The innovation had entered frontier building practice. Emma Hartwell lived in her barn cabin until 1863, when she sold her property and moved to live with her sister's family in Ohio. She was 51 years old and ready for a quieter life. The new owner of her property maintained the barn cabin structure, which remained sound and weatherproof after 20 years. Modern historians estimate that variations of the Hartwell method were used in at least several dozen frontier structures during the mid-1800s. The exact number is unknown, because many remote homesteads left no records. But the principle of protecting firewood through integrated barn-dwelling construction appeared in enough locations to suggest widespread adoption. The innovation saved lives by ensuring families had access to dry fuel during harsh winters. Wet firewood created smoke that caused respiratory illness. Inadequate fuel led to hypothermia. The Hartwell method addressed both problems through simple engineering, a barn surrounding a house with firewood stored between. The solution was not complicated, but it required someone to question traditional methods and build something different. Emma's legacy was not carved in stone or written in books. It was built into structures that sheltered families through frontier winters. The impossible had become routine. A woman who lost her husband to wet firewood had ensured that others would not face the same tragedy.